that stuck with me that I think is true and is very useful when it comes to thinking about life and marriage. And this is what he said. He said, John, there can be a big difference between a marriage of two Christians and a Christian marriage. And I thought that was one of the most important things for me to think about. There can be a big difference between a marriage of two Christians and a Christian marriage. They are not the same thing. In fact, unfortunately, often they're not the same thing. What do you think he was saying with that statement? It's not a complicated statement. It's just a useful statement. Yeah. Okay, so if Jesus has to be in the center of the marriage, yeah, okay. When we say we have to have Jesus in the center of the marriage, what are we saying? Okay, so we're following Christ and we are seeking to treat each other in a manner that, as imperfect as we might be, we're looking to Christ and we're desiring to follow what he calls us to be, who he calls us to be as we imitate him. And that's a really, really useful thing to know that there is one in front of us that as we look at him, we have his example, we learn from his wisdom and his truth, and we seek to live that out in relationship to each other. So people can profess faith, they can declare their commitment to follow Christ, and yet, in the way that they live their marriage, and we've talked about marriage as your primary, priority, most intimate human union, in the way that they live their marriage, they will choose not to follow Jesus. And that's a problematic claim, then, to say that I follow Jesus, but in the way that you live in relation to your primary, priority, most intimate relationship, you choose not to follow Jesus. I'm reminded of the time, and it's just before Jesus tells the story about the foolish person who tried to build their house on the sand. I'm reminded of the time when Jesus says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I tell you?" That's a very, very interesting statement that he makes to people who are walking along with him, listening to him. He says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and then do not do what I tell you?" And what he's saying in that moment is obvious. They're using the words Lord, Lord, Master, Master, person that I want to listen to, but their actions are giving a lie to their words. So one area where we really need to think about following Jesus is how we communicate with each other. And more specifically in our present focus, we want to take some time and think about how we communicate with our spouses. Because sometimes how we communicate with our primary priority relationship seems actually to value that primary priority relationship less than we value the way that we communicate with others. And so it's a useful thing to think about this. I'm a little worried when I use the word communication that it might sound too technical, too much like we're worried about techniques and tools. And that can move us away from understanding that this is spiritual and this is relational and this is moral. And a big part of how we talk with and relate with each other is a faith and a faithfulness issue. And so I want us to really think about this not just as, okay, what tools or techniques do we use, but I want us to think about this from the point of view of the fact that if I am going to honor Christ, and if I am going to be faithful in the way that I live, and if I'm going to be honoring my spouse, and if I'm going to be faithful in the way that I live toward them, this is a matter that really is a heart issue rather than just a technique issue. And struggles here are often the struggles of the flesh and against our flesh and against our sin nature, and they're heart matters that we need to address. So tools and techniques, particular skills, they can help us visualize heart truth. But the word communication means co-munis, okay, share with. It's not the same as community, that's with unity. The origin of this word communication is co and municipality. And so the whole idea is, who do you share your life with? And communication is about sharing your life with someone. And how we communicate has much to do with where our hearts are and how we share our life with that person. So the question that we're considering is, what needs to be going on in my heart so that I can rightly share with and respond to my primary, priority, permanent, most deeply intimate partner? And with that, when I share with her, and I'm going to use the word her because I'm talking about me for the moment, okay? When I share with her, what is she receiving from me? And what am I receiving from her? When I share with her, when I communicate with her, what is she receiving from me? When she shares with me, what am I receiving from her? And it's an important thing because, I mean, we talk plenty of times with our minds on autopilot. So it's a really, really important thing to have self-awareness and to examine our actions and manner in submission to God's Spirit against the measure of biblical truth. This is a good thing if we take and measure it against biblical truth. And it's possible to know how we should speak to our most important human connection and how we should use words and tone and manner, but then to treat that most important person in our lives as mattering less than casual acquaintances or friends. And I want you to think about that, okay? Here's a couple of things to consider. First thing to consider, is my conversational tone with my spouse in private, is it as considerate in private, and are my words as carefully chosen in private as they would be if we were in a public space? That's a really, really good thing to think about, because you know that you don't want to embarrass yourself in the public space by being inconsiderate in your words. So this is a first question to consider when it comes to our communication. Is my conversational tone with my spouse in private as considerate, and are my words as carefully chosen in private as they would be if we were in a public space? And I say that because I want to enforce what I'm saying when I say many times we know how we should communicate, but take away accountability to other people listening in, and we don't. So that's the first thing. Here's my second thing, and this is a bit of a thought experiment for you. And I want you to think about this thought experiment. If there were CCTV cameras through your home, that sounds creepy, right? If there were CCTV cameras throughout your home and someone told you that you could earn $1 million for communicating with your spouse in a way that is considerate and kind and devoid of careless words over the next week. If they told you over the next week, as the CCTV cameras watch you, if you hit it right when it comes to communication with your spouse, would the possibility of a big payoff motivate you more than the possibility of a great marriage? Think about that. If you knew you could earn $1 million, would that motivate you to be more careful with your words than just the possibility of a great marriage? And I'm putting that out as a thought experiment, and you're saying to yourself, well, that's a really silly thought experiment. No, it's not. It's a biblical thought experiment. If she's worth more than rubies, according to Proverbs 31, but I'm treating her as worth less than rubies, that's a useful thing to think about. When I think I told you about the verse from Song of Songs that I calligraphized and gave to Joanne back when we were engaged. That just, I mean, this is a verse that really sticks in my mind, where it says the concluding words in that verse are essentially, if a man was to give all of the wealth of his house and think that it was worth more than love, he would be an idiot. That's the John Twynham paraphrase of it. But it says he would be utterly contemptible. Now, so when I do this thought experiment, the thought experiment has biblical precedent. Worth more than rubies. You're an idiot if you think all of the money of your house is worth more than your marriage to your wife. You know, and so I ask this: if there were CCTV cameras throughout your home and someone told you you could earn $1 million for communicating with your spouse in a way that is considerate and kind and devoid of careless words, would the possibility of $1 million be more motivation to you than the possibility of a great marriage? And it's a useful thing to stop and think. So we come to this matter of communication. Pastor Zeth's going to be speaking from Galatians 5 today. And as he does, part of what he's looking at is what the Apostle Paul has to say about the works of the flesh. In other words, the kind of things that flow out of the human heart when the Spirit of God is not shaping it, and when the life of the individual is not in step with the Spirit. And as I take a look at those works of the flesh, and I'm not going to steal his thunder, but as I take a look at those works of the flesh, it's interesting to note that at least half of these dark and sinful tendencies are likely to show first in the words that we use. At least 8 of the 15, and you could probably make the case for even more of them, but at least 8 of the 15 works of the flesh show first in the words that we use. And that's a really, really significant thing to consider. And it's useful to recognize, too, that our culture is coarsening. What's accepted in the manner of communication is often not good. And there's all sorts of reasons why our culture is coarsening. I mean, we know some of the crazy arguments that take place on social media, and people show no sense of conscience or no holdback in the way that they say things to each other when they're saying it over screens. And we know about the political polarization that's taken place. And we know even just about the fact of the acceptable growth of profanity. I was on my way to see Dorothy Wilcox the other day, and as I was on my way to see her, I stopped briefly at Tim Hortons, and I was going to sit down and have a coffee at Tim Hortons, and I took my books in with me to actually be working on this lesson. And so I sat down and I was having a coffee and I was working on this. And as I was working on this, there was 2 ladies that were sitting the table over from me, and they were probably in their late 60s, early 70s. And I couldn't believe the F words coming out of their mouths. I thought, that's a really, really amazing thing. The coarsening of the culture and the coarsening of our manner of speech with each other. And I don't expect that that's happening inside of this gathered group of people. But I watched and I thought that is something that, well, I mean, we know what they've done as far as they've dropped broadcast standards and everything else related to this. So there's this coarsening of the way that people share with each other. And we hope that it hasn't entered into our homes, but we certainly know what we're swimming in when it comes to the coarsening of the culture. So what biblical realities do we need to keep in the front of our minds to help us to protect our covenant relationship when it comes to communication with each other? And there's a whole bunch of stuff. Some of this comes straight from the wisdom literature, and I'm going to ask you to turn with me in Proverbs first. I really like these verses that I'm going to share. These were verses actually that we required our kids to memorize, and they were required to memorize them. And every so often, what would happen is someone would say something to somebody else, and when they said something to somebody else, the response to them would start out, "A word fitly spoken is like," and they would say, "apples of gold in settings of silver." Or else we would say, "Reckless words cut like a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing." You know, and those were things that the kids knew they were going to hear on a regular basis as we talked about communicating between them. And and they still said stupid things. and I'm sure that like us as adults, they still have things that come out of their mouth after they've said them. They say, oh, I shouldn't have said that. But we wanted to start with this particular understanding, and as we bring it across to marriage, what I'm going to say is this: your words can bless or your words can bloody your spouse. Your words can bless your spouse or your words can bloody your spouse. And I'm using that in the light of those two verses. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold, or appropriately spoken or well thought through is like apples of gold in settings of silver. In other words, it's a beautiful thing. It's a blessing. It's something that actually benefits the person to whom it's being spoken. And the other one, reckless words cut like a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. So, in the early stages of your relationship, think about this. When you were first smitten by and trying to attract the other person, if you had any sense, and if you wanted to build something good, you were probably very thoughtful and very careful and made sure that you guarded and cultivated that relationship by your words. You probably made sure that you didn't take shots at that person, because of the fact that you thought to yourself, I want to make sure that this guy or this girl likes me. And so you would guard your words. And wisdom literature has many things to say about well-chosen words for any human relationship, like apples of gold in settings of silver. How you use your words ongoing is reflective of the value you give to a relationship and the value you give to a person. How you use your words toward them reflects how you value them and reflects how they feel valued. So here's a simple reflection. How often did you intentionally bless your spouse with your words this week? Now, I don't really want a number, because it'd be far better off if this is a norm that we don't have to mark as a red letter day because of its rarity. But how often did you intentionally bless your spouse with your words this week? And when I say intentionally bless, here's some categories for you, and you can actually make note of these and consider these categories. The categories, when I think of intentionally blessing your spouse with your words are affection, gratitude, admiration, offers of assistance. Pardon? Affection, gratitude, admiration, offers of assistance. Joanne's making category heads right now, and she's thinking, did he actually follow through on any of those things? Okay. Affection, gratitude, admiration, offers of assistance. If it's a norm, and this isn't flattery or a ploy, your marriage is probably prospering. Okay? When I say prospering, I mean you are probably really finding joy in your marriage. If it is a norm that you express affection, gratitude, admiration, and offers of assistance, if that's what comes out of your mouth, it's almost a guarantee that you're experiencing a good relationship. And that might seem awfully strong for me to state, but what we share with each other has a dramatic impact in what our relationship looks like. On the other side, reckless words might have been a norm in your upbringing. And I know that is a possibility, that you experienced an upbringing or a life where what happened was people saying things that were careless and reckless and inconsiderate might have been something that was far too frequent. And that can become a pattern too. And it's possible that some might even justify themselves with the thought that, well, she's a big girl or he's a big boy, I don't have to be that careful with my words. Acting like their spouse is immune to reckless words, or figuring that if their spouse has been reckless, well, they're just going to get back the kind of things that they give. It's possible to think in those terms. And if you act like your spouse is immune, or it seems that they are, if that is the case, that's not good. Relationally, what happens is you build insensitivity and scarring. And the question is, have you had a part in hardening your spouse by your words? And I think that that's a useful thing to think about. Have I had a part in hardening my spouse by my words? This is not to say that everybody walks around constantly waiting to be insulted and constantly having, walking on eggshells and having this tendency to take offense easily. I'm not saying live in a state of taking offense easily, but I'm saying live in a state of really, really deliberately with your words choosing not to give hurts, not to cut like a sword. If you're open and familiar with each other, with deep affection and consideration, it's wonderful. If you're able to be playful with each other without any sting of mockery, that's a good thing. This is not cut-out teasing or anything like that. Teasing that has no, you know the difference between a tease that is a joyful tease and a tease that carries with it just that little element of truth that you're thinking, I'm going to get him. There's a big difference between the tease that enhances and the tease that carries just enough of a sting to make them think that you remember what they did that you're not happy with and that you're going to let them hear that. There's a big difference. So, the unguarded words that invite mockery or that are careless about wounding, even if it's followed by a weak, but I didn't really mean it. These things leave hardening scars. And this is something that is important for us to think about as we think about wanting to experience the fullness of the goodness and blessing of God in the way that we relate to each other. And if you happen to be quick-witted and you happen to have the capacity for a sharp tongue, it's a really, really important thing to understand how that can play itself out. And maybe it's become a norm to the point where you say, well, they don't really feel it. It's not that big a deal. But the fact is, it is. So, second thing is we're thinking things through biblically when it comes to communication. Controlling your tongue, this is a useful one to understand. Controlling your tongue means that you're growing up. Now, I don't know, that's quite often, today what happens is we're in a culture that rewards the quick rebuttal and the quick comeback, and that thinks having those quick rebuttals and quick comebacks is the best. That's part of why the electorate is so bad at picking national leaders. I mean, if you want to think about how terrible our political process is and how few wise people we seem to have at the top when it comes to picking political leaders, consider the fact that the electorate largely prefers sound bites and the ability to take shots at each other to thoughtful expressions of policy. How many times when a question is asked, are you expecting someone to show a well thought through, are we expecting political leaders to show a well thought through explanation for why they take a particular policy? And how many times is it far more likely that what we're looking for is a 5-word comeback that really seals the deal? I don't know where it is now, but late night television used to be basically about a matter of quick quip and humor in the name of mockery and unkindness. And I mean, a number of years back, they talked about the fact that we'd entered into the age of irony. And by the age of irony, it meant this continual mocking, cynical tone that shapes communication. So controlling your tongue means that you're growing up. And much of what passes for humor today is built out of mockery and unkindness. We don't want to be quick to take offense because that is immature too, but we don't want to be casual about giving it. So I want you to turn over with me, please, to James chapter 3. James is actually kind of like it's the New Testament parallel to Proverbs. The book of James is the wisdom literature of the New Testament. And in James chapter 3 it says this, verse 1, it says, "Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness." And then a lot of you are saying, "Whew, that's good. That means I don't have to be a teacher." I'm glad for that. But it goes on and it says this, "For we all stumble in many ways, and if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle his whole body." And when we read perfect there, I want you to read complete, entire. Okay, someone who does not stumble with their words is a complete and entire person, able to take control of their whole body. If we put bits into the mouths of horses so that they obey us, we guide their whole bodies as well. Look at the ships also. Although they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they're guided by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. How great a fire is set ablaze by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our bodies, our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, and set on fire by hell. Now, that's pretty strong. We're not going to go on and take time and do an exposition of it, but consider what's being said here. It goes from the fact that if you demonstrate some degree of control over your tongue, if you can control your tongue, then you're showing self-control and you're showing maturity. And then it goes on and it says, more often than not, the tongue controls us. Our words control us. And as our words control us, they do massive damage. So James 3 says that the person who uses their words well in a controlled fashion is a mature person. He warns that words out of control do a lot of damage. And as we read what he says, we see that maturity is rarer than it ought to be. God's word has much to say about controlling our words, but we're focusing on two ideas from James. As I said, the New Testament counterpart of Proverbs, of the wisdom literature of Proverbs. And the first thing that I want to think about is this. If we're going to control our tongues, we need to learn to listen first. It's a really, really important thing to learn to listen first. Just turn back a couple of pages to James 1. These are verses that probably many of you know already. In James 1, we read this in verse 19 and 20. "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God." Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. In premarital counseling, as I'm involved in that, one of the things that we talk about is something that is being called active listening. And active listening is deliberately committing to listen to what your spouse has said and to understand it and to understand where it's come from rather than what you are interpreting. And interpretation happens in a couple of ways. Well, first of all, sometimes what happens is you're in the middle of conversation, and as you're in the middle of conversation, you're already thinking about your rebuttal and the things that you want to say before they finish what they have to say. And so active listening says, okay, don't be thinking about your rebuttal, be thinking about what they have to say to the end. And then what happens is it says, and after you've listened to them right to the end, then say it back to them in such a way that makes it clear that you not only have listened to them, but also that you are not making a straw man out of what they've said. You are actually stating it in a way that they would say, yeah, that's a really fair understanding of what I just said. That's a really fair treatment of my words. So this is something that we encourage because of the fact that people can jump ahead and already be planning on their answer. And the other thing is we really need to be people who are listening fully, so that what happens is we don't give the worst possible interpretation on someone's words that we could. You don't have to put your hands up, but I'll ask this question. How many of you are good at reading between the lines? Hearing a set of words said, and after you hear the set of words said, coming up with an interpretation of those words that is not what was said. When you think about that, that is a very frequent characteristic of people when it comes to conversation. And some of you are saying, don't say it, John, don't say it, John. So I'm being very, very careful not to say it. But that is a gender-based tendency. Okay? So I will just say though, this is something that's a really, really important thing to consider. That when we are active listeners, we wait to hear the end of what has been said, and we think it through, and we give it back in the fairest version possible. And the second thing is, and we don't interpret in between the lines. It's better to listen in black and white. It's interesting. Joanne and I had a conversation. We've had conversations about this before, and some really, really kind of cool conversations, because every so often what happens is, there are people, even as sweet as she is, that say things to her that aren't the nicest. But what happens is, quite often, they say it in kind of a passive-aggressive way. When they've said it, they'll say it in a passive-aggressive way, so that the whole idea is that they don't say it, but she's supposed to get it in the subtext in between the lines. I've said, you know what, Joanne? One of the best things you can possibly do when they do something that's meant to be subtext between the lines is don't get it. If you just take it at face value, there's nothing more frustrating to a person who's taking shots at you than if you take their words at face value and treat them as black and white. But guess what? That's grown-up conversation. Grown-up conversation isn't passive-aggressive. Grown-up conversation isn't what's between the lines. Grown-up conversation is actually speaking what you mean. Telling the truth, rather than taking and saying, what can I do between the lines to get across what I want? And it's a huge thing. It's a huge thing for us to consider that when we control our tongues, we want to be people who are learning to listen first. And in difficult conversation with your spouse, do you also have a deliberate conversation with yourself in your mind that says, don't talk right away. Listen and try to understand first. That is, I think, a really useful thing. There needs to be two conversations that are taking place. One that's happening between you and the other person when it's a challenging conversation, but the other one that's happening in your mind that says, don't talk right away. Slow down, listen, think, hear what they have to say, try and understand where it's coming from, and then respond. Because when we do that, we are far more likely to be able to talk, to communicate, to share with in a way that's effective. It's useful because it's easy to have this conversation, because it's easy for me to start to formulate what I think or what I want to say before I've even made sure that I understand the other person. And this is an important thing. We need to make sure that we try to understand the other person. Okay, as I kind of expected, I've run out of time. But any questions or thoughts just before we close? Everybody's being swift to hear, slow to speak. Because then they know that they're just going to get angry if they do speak. Okay, let's pray. Father, thank you for allowing us to take time and to think about what it means to communicate in a way that's going to be effective and that's going to be loving and that's going to allow us to care for each other in the way that we should. And I pray that we would be people who pursue this, that we would desire to use our words in a way that they are apples of gold in settings of silver, and that we would be desiring to bless and care for each other and build relationship rather than either tearing a person down or just choosing to get our way. Help us to be people who want to make sure that we are actually loving in the way that we speak to each other, that we are actually caring for and sharing with each other in a way that is in keeping with the nature and character of Christ. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.